Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Tuesday. So today we're talking about design guidelines. And in particular, we're going to, last time we talked about public space guidelines, William White and his film that you all saw. And today we're going to shift to facilities guidelines like classrooms and homes, hospitals, things like that. So before we get into that, I want to show you a couple of video clips on people creating public spaces at work in Brooklyn and creating third places. Remember, Jane Jacobs says that the more you can have a diversity of uses and you can have people coming in at different times of day in an urban neighborhood, the more vibrant, the safer it's going to be. So we're going to show you a couple of examples of those. And
and then at night, an event space where people can come and learn about new, good things that are going on.
Basically, it's a platform for creativity. And then each color, like this is the red.
That bike powers a DC generator and literally supplies power to the appliances as they're pedaling. And they see a real direct connection between the electricity that they use and how much energy it takes to power it.
Okay, so the deal is people bring books, and we have a library here, and they can trade.
We're starting a new campaign called Speak Now, and basically having video appeals from Americans, our generation, to our congressional leaders, to our elected officials, demanding political action on climate change, on global warming right now.
Well, it's New York City condoms. They've redesigned their packaging, and in 1 month, they gave away 3.5 million condoms, just because of the redesign of the packaging.
15 minutes till
I mean, the spaces come together really well, but the people make the space, so I can't wait.
so that's one example of some people getting together in an urban neighborhood and trying to create a center, community center that's open at different hours of night. People can go in, do different things during the day, and get involved in various projects. And some of you said when you were observing what was missing from Irvine, we don't have those kind of settings that go past like 10 p.m. in this place. So in New York, you have more of that, of course, but even in some of those neighborhoods, people have this desire to create even more lively, interesting choices, where they can go and do different things. Now, this next example is also from New York, and it shows how some folks took a section of the neighborhood there and created more of a livable public space, kind of like what William White talks about, although White was talking about these very high-density urban plazas. This is more of a lower-density neighborhood in Brooklyn.
So here we are on Willoughby Street in a new pedestrian public space created by the Department of Transportation and the Metrotech Business Improvement District. There's not a lot of seating in downtown Brooklyn. There's actually not a lot of great public spaces in downtown Brooklyn. And this is a wonderful success story. They took a street that was devoted to cars and a lot of parking spaces and turned it into a wonderful pedestrian space. They have put out movable seating, planters, bicycle racks, tables with umbrellas and shade structures. They've created a destination for downtown office workers, for people from all over Brooklyn to come and spend some time in a way they hadn't been able to before. The great thing about this is that they just went ahead and did this. It wasn't a lot of studies, it wasn't a long plan. They just said, hey, let's try it. Let's experiment, see if it's possible. There's hundreds of opportunities for this kind of thing all over the city. Our streets are New York City's greatest public space asset. Part of transportation and part of DOT planning should be to help create the destinations that draw people here. The role of the DOT isn't just to move traffic faster or even move people through any given place faster. The role of the Department of Transportation should actually be to enhance our experience of our public spaces and our transportation system. It should be to help create destinations, to create the reasons to move about in the first place.
Okay, so those are a couple of examples of taking some urban spaces and trying to create more public and sociable feel to them. All right, so we're going to go to the PowerPoints and talk about design guidelines today. And we've had a lot of examples of design guidelines in the course already, and you can think back to some of those from William White to Gell and Gemzo about creating good scale, human scale in cities. So these are examples of some works that have been done on creating design guidelines. This one here by Claire Cooper Marcus and Wendy Sarkissian at Berkeley, and they developed a whole slew of design guidelines for medium density housing. Over here you've got guidelines for urban open space, similar to what William White has been talking about. Now on the next slide is the link that I mentioned to you, so if you want to go back to William White and take a look at his video and make sure you're clear on these different things he's talking about in terms of how they affect public space. Here you've got that example of putting a piano in the middle of an urban setting and creating triangulation. So by having somebody sit down and start playing boogie or classical or whatever they want to play, these people gather around. It creates a more informal feeling. It creates a more sociable place. So that Play Me, I'm Yours program, where their pianos are being put in various urban spaces around different cities, is one example of what White talks about in terms of triangulation. So you guys should be clear on what triangulation is. It sounds like a complex word, but it's basically creating interesting events in places that bring people together and make them more informal. So do check out that link, and if you haven't seen the film, and go over that. Now, in the next few slides, just building on the public place design guidelines, here you see in Santa Ana, you see the Upper South Main Street. And this is a project that was done by one of our Masters of Urban Regional Planning students, Suya Zhu. And she was interested in, how could we make Main Street in Santa Ana more sociable, more safe, more interesting? So she used various kinds of simulation strategies to take some of these spaces here and include some of the amenities that William White talks about. So here you see the section of Main Street that she's looking at here, and in the next slide here, you see kind of what she's done. So go back to the previous, Mark, for a minute. One more. So you take out those things. Now look at what she's layered in here. One more. Where she's added some mixed uses. She's added some protection here for people waiting for the bus. She's added some street trees. She's added sittable space, some protection for a bike lane. So those kind of things have a way of humanizing that space, even though it's a retail, fairly high-traffic environment. By bringing in those kind of uses, she presented these proposals to the Santa Ana City Council and Orange County Planning Commission. So they're under consideration for implementation. Now, on the next slide, and so, by the way, you can see here how she's labeled each of these. This is an annotated plan, just like John Zeisel talked about annotated floor plans. What she's done here for the planners and the designers is she's kind of made very specific what she's adding in here. And then to go along with that, there's text explaining why those elements have been added. Here again, you've got another part of Middle Main Street. So in the next slide, you're going to see what she adds in here. She's created a kind of enclosed garden space here with some benches, some sittable space. Makes that area much more attractive for people walking down the street. She's got some more street trees. So you can see how these guidelines bringing in sun, bringing in natural elements that White talks about, are being layered into this area fairly close to where we are, and creating a little bit more artistic, interesting visual stimuli here, more safety for the pedestrians here, some public art. By bringing art into a space, you can make it a lot more sociable and interesting to people. Vertical mixed use, so she's got now some mixture of uses in this particular building, residential, retail, a little pocket park here. So those are some examples of how you can mix uses in an area and create a better space. Here again, you've got, now she's looking at lower South Main Street, and this is one of the stores there. And in the next treatment of the slide, you can see she's added some different textures. She's added a lot of street planting here to make this sidewalk more amenable to pedestrians. So these are, again, some things that you can do. You can add this green space, the tree shade, window displays, anything that can create a more interesting visual experience and make people feel more comfortable like they belong there. Now we're going to show you one more video before we go to this, and this is something that Michelle Kim in our class brought in, and it's about a guy in Brooklyn that calls himself a vigilante badass gardener. So we'll see what that's all about.
This week, I decided to break the law in the gentlest way possible. For 2 years, this area near my apartment has been accumulating dead leaves and trash and cat urine. It's ugly, and it just seems like a waste, especially considering how few green spaces there are in Brooklyn. So I'm going to take over this neglected spot, and I'm going to grow a garden. I'd read about people doing this sort of thing. You become sort of a vigilante gardener. My plan, on Friday at midnight, sneak in and fill the spot with flowers and vegetables. I spent a few weeks preparing, pre-planting, gathering the proper equipment. I drew an overhead diagram. I imagined something huge, maybe even bountiful. I invited a bunch of friends to help, thinking we'd form an X-Men-like crew to deliver our brand of street justice. But as the evening approached, one by one, my X-Men bailed on me. I got excuses that ranged from having to hang out with their mom, to midnight being too late, to allergies. I can't blame them. I mean, after all, we were working above the law at this point. And really, who wants to go to jail for planting sunflower seeds? But my girlfriend Juliana and a few courageous crusaders agreed to help out. We worked quickly, cleaning out the broken glass, the cigarette lighters, large chunks of metal. We filled the spot with organic soil and planted a perimeter of marigolds, which acts as a natural pest repellent. Tomatoes, potatoes, chives, strawberries, basil, oregano, thyme, sunflowers, and a row of peas that will climb up the chain link and hopefully over the barbed wire fence. We felt like total badasses. The police passed by, and we froze. Thankfully, they never confronted us. Actually, really a wise choice on their part. I guess I've always had this silly superhero fantasy, but fast cars and violence really aren't my speed. Cleaning up trash and planting cherry tomatoes, that's more me. A stranger named Donnie walked by, and he was the most positive, encouraging drunk person I've ever encountered.
You know, it's such a change for 8th Avenue. It's so nice.
The next day, he emailed me, and he offered to help water the garden whenever we needed. You know, if the owners of the spot ever track me down, I promise to give half of whatever I grow to them, and if they never come forward, I'd like to give half the vegetables to someone who could really use it. To be honest, in the light of day, the garden looks pretty pitiful, but it's just a beginning.
Okay, so that's another example of someone taking charge of their neighborhood and bringing in some green space. So some of you might want to try that in your neighborhood. And there's actually a follow-up to that we're going to show a little bit later when we talk about natural environment and restorative psychological restoration from nature. But this book here, we've talked about it before. It's Christopher Alexander's tome. It's a very massive, detailed work where he lays out 250 different patterns or scenarios for good design, rules of thumb for making good places. And together they form this coherent approach to creating good spaces. And in the next slide, you can see when we talk about design guidelines, we mean going from a sort of general behavioral statement, like people like to be able to regulate their privacy, or they like exposure to sunlight or natural light in buildings, or they need a gradient from intimate to more public kind of spaces. And if you don't have that gradient from formal into informal, the place doesn't work very good. Well, those are behavioral statements drawn from that toolbox of concepts and findings I told you about from environmental psychology, what we covered in the first half of this course before the midterm. And then what you do is you go to a performance standard. You begin to tie those findings or those principles to some particular way of dealing with the environment to make it more supportive. So you can say, in a store, you want to lay out the spaces in the store from public, formal, to the more informal private spaces, the back spaces where the staff that work there can go and sort of have more privacy from others that come in as customers. So you can start creating some standards of how you deal with environments to build in these environmental psychological principles. And a prescriptive guideline gets even more specific in terms of exact numbers, like, you know, if you have a floor space in a building that's 100 square feet, make sure you have at least a quarter of the wall space devoted to windows. So 25 to 50 square feet of that wall space should be devoted to windows if you have a 100 square foot room. That's a very prescriptive guideline. It says not only should you give people windows, but exactly how to do it. If you're a designer, this is how much in feet or millimeters or whatever you want to measure that you need to do in order to make that standard work. So we're going from sort of very general, what people think and feel, to more physical, concrete reality, what the designer works with. That's what a design guideline does. It translates the research and the principles and the findings into concrete principles of how to design a place. So what I'd like you to do now, we're going to do a little in-class participation exercise where, now, you know, assigned for today, there were two design guidelines in particular by Chris Alexander. One's called Intimacy Gradient, the other's called Windows Overlooking Life. So let me read you what he says about the intimacy gradient. He says, unless spaces in a building are arranged in a sequence that corresponds to the degrees of privateness, the visits made by strangers, friends, guests, clients, family will always be a little awkward. People need a gradient of settings that have different degrees of intimacy. And when they have that gradient, they can place themselves, depending on their relationship to the occupants, where they belong. So if you're a visitor to somebody's home, you don't like go right back to their bedroom, right? You go in the kind of anteroom or the living room where you come in the front door, or in a Peruvian home, you might go into the sala. And that's one of the examples he gives. So the behavioral statement is that people need that gradient of intimacy in order to organize their relationships. And that happens whether you're in a store, whether you're in a home, whether you're in a healthcare setting, whatever. You need that gradient from formal to informal, from private or public to more private and intimate. And he said that this has been observed in widely different cultures. This need for intimacy gradient has been observed in a lot of different countries, a lot of different ethnicities. And it applies to just about every building type, from homes, shops, office buildings, churches even. So he's saying it's a pretty widely known, widely needed kind of concept. So that's your behavioral concept. And then on the next page he says, okay, if that's your concept, therefore, lay out the spaces of a building so that they create a sequence which begins with the entrance and the most public parts of the building and then leads into the slightly more private areas and finally to the most private domains. And he gets even more specific and says if you're talking about a bathroom, then you kind of want to put that halfway between the real public and the real private. So if somebody's visiting your home as a guest, they can get to the bathroom just as somebody that lives there. So you don't want to put those all the way in the back area. So he's got these guidelines or performance standards. Now, in the next guideline you read about, Windows Overlooking Life, he starts out with some behavioral statements. He says, you know, rooms without a view are prisons for the people that have to stay in them. When people are in a place for any length of time, they need to be able to refresh themselves by looking at a world different from the one they're in. So, you know, students might like some windows to sort of look outside. Usually we don't put windows in classrooms because we want everybody to be focused on the lecture. But people, he's saying, need that sort of change of pace. They need to be able to take a break from what they're looking at on their desk or computer, look outside and refresh their view. Talks about how people always evaluate windowless rooms and buildings very negatively. They feel trapped. They feel kind of cloistered. They don't like it. People, when given a choice, always choose offices that have windows, that have natural light. And typically people prefer windows that have meaningful views. They have good view amenities. You look out, you see some trees, you see a park, you see activity out there, rather than just the back of a building. So we saw that in Ulrich's study of people recovering from gallbladder surgery. The more they had views of nature, the faster they recovered, the less pain medication they requested. So this is what he means by quality of views. It's not just the windows. People like to be looking at meaningful stuff that's interesting, that's nice, it's comforting, it's restorative, as we're going to find out in a later lecture. So therefore, going from the behavioral statement to the design principle, or the design guideline, he says, place the windows in such a way that their total area conforms roughly to the appropriate figures for your region. He says 25% or more of floor area in San Francisco Bay Area. So he says, you know, if you're in Antarctica, where it's freezing cold, or you're in a really hot environment, maybe you want to change those ratios of how much window space to floor space. So it's going to vary by region, and it may vary by culture. But if you go into a particular place, if you go in Irvine to 6 or 7 buildings, and you ask people what are the rooms they really like, and then take a look at how the windows are placed and how much area is devoted to windows, you'll start to see these relationships where the more preferred rooms and spaces have that 25% or better kind of window coverage, at least for our region. That's what he's saying. So these things are going to vary, but then he gets really prescriptive, and he says, you know, and this is where he's got a prescriptive guideline. He says at least 25 to 50 square foot of wall space should be devoted to windows for every 100 square feet of floor space. That's like a formula. That's very prescriptive. So that's what we mean by telling the designer exactly how to manipulate that space in terms of the physical parameters they're working with. Not all design guidelines get to that specific a level. Some of them stay at this performance standard, which says, you know, you better give people some windows or else they're not going to like that space very much. That's a much more general kind of performance standard. So those are the kinds of things that you're trying to do in these papers, and you could do it for human scale, you could do it for people's need for windows, you could do it for creating effective public spaces like William White was talking about. You can do it for creating third places. You know, Jane Jacobs says the more interesting mixed uses you have in a city or a neighborhood, the better that neighborhood's going to work. So how do you create those third places? And we showed an example in that pop-up community center in the video where a group of people got together and they wanted to create a, sort of a multi-function place that worked for people different times a day, was safe, was interesting. So those are the kinds of principles that, you know, we're talking about environmental psychology, and now we're saying, well, how do you translate that into improving environments or improving communities or neighborhoods? So that's really what we're focusing on, okay? Now, this is that intimacy gradient. We've talked about it before, and so this is sort of review, you know, laying out the spaces so they create this sequence from public to private, formal to informal, whether you're talking about a residential area, commercial area, what have you. This is the other pattern that was assigned, the windows overlooking life, and these are only a couple of his 200-plus patterns. So he had a lot to say about how do you create a nice cafe on a main street? How do you create a main street? Like we were talking about Santa Ana Main Street. How do you do that? So he had all these ideas and rules of thumb that he put out there in this pattern language book, and it's been very influential in the field of architecture. And here you can see these view amenities I was talking about. So this person has a view of trees and nature, and she can tell what time of day it is. She can see the shadows as the sun changes position. So you don't feel like you're cut off from reality. Here you've got this nice set of windows in Stockholm overlooking the river there. And you see trees, you see water, you see some interesting textured buildings. So that's a high amenity kind of view. It's not just looking out at a blank slate where you don't have anything interesting. Here you've got a bedroom that's devoting more than 25% of that wall space to views of nature. So these are the kinds of principles that Alexander and his colleagues were talking about. And he was a professor at UC Berkeley for many years. He's now retired from there. But if you go to this website, Pattern Language, you'll see kind of the scope of his work, which has had a lot of influence in the field. So rooms without a view are prisons for the people who have to stay in them. And when people are in these kind of spaces, And here you've got some interior windows, but that doesn't do much for bringing natural light in or making people feel connected outside. So this is that performance. This is actually the behavioral statement or the concept, and then the performance standard flows from that. How do you provide those windows in an environment when you design it? How much window space, et cetera. So that's where you get this prescriptive guideline, provide 25 to 50 square feet, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, according to Alexander, which is where he did a lot of his research. That's the kind of ratio you want. So this is a very prescriptive formula. Many of you have probably seen this building in Irvine. It's called the Atrium on Von Karman. And you can look at that and see how much window space. That's way more than 25 to 50% of the building skin devoted to windows. And some wondered whether that was going to be a very effective building, whether people would rent offices there, because it was so weird. The spaces are not exactly square. You've got so much window space. You know, the designers were worried that people might be put off. But it's turned out to be one of the most popular office buildings in the area. And, of course, there's a very nice restaurant down on the first floor called the Stangos. So it has different uses going on. But you can see how this attention to natural light and to windows is really exemplified by that particular building. So why is it that people like windows? What is it about windows that they really like? Well, we talked about the view amenities, being able to see interesting things outside and be refreshed by, going from your interior environment to outside. There's this sense of connection with outside events and the cycle of the day, so you can see where the sun is, you can see it's getting dark. You can enjoy those different seasons of the day, so to speak. There are some health and productivity benefits of natural light and fresh air. And we know that research has been done on UV light, bringing UV light into settings that don't have a lot of sunlight. For example, older people living in institutions for the elderly in Boston were studied. They were living in a winter climate, and they brought in UV light bulbs that give off a certain spectrum of UV light, ultraviolet. And we know that ultraviolet light can create risk for cancer, certain kinds of skin cancer. But the tricky thing is at the same time, it's very beneficial for vitamin D metabolism. And it was found that the people that were exposed to these UV lights had fewer fractures from falls because their bones, their vitamin D synthesis was better. So natural lighting actually does have some very beneficial effects if you're not exposed to it in excess. And finally, there are these status considerations that always get primed by the issue of windows. So when you look at the status hierarchy in an organization, the people typically on the top floors and the corner spaces with multiple windows are the people that lead the organization. And the worker bees and staff members are often in offices and cubicles that don't have any natural light or window space at all. So these are principles that seem to be multicultural. They seem to be observed across a lot of different building types. And in that sense, they are these design rules of thumb or guidelines based on these principles. Now, when people are forced to be in windowless spaces, they adapt. Okay, how do they adapt? Well, one of the things they do, they try to create more interesting visual stimuli in their space. They put up more stuff on the wall. They try to make it more interesting because they can't look outside and see anything interesting. So they want the interior to be more decorated, to be more tailored to their needs. The other thing they do, and we've seen this before, is they maybe create their own window. They put up a landscape poster with some curtains and they pretend they have a window. And this study that's assigned for today, it's a very interesting study. They looked at 75 offices at the University of Washington. And when people were in the office, they asked permission, can they come in and do a little survey audit of their wall space. And they looked at how much window space they had. Some of the offices were windowless. And then they looked at what they had on the wall. And any of you recall some of the findings from that study? What were some of the key findings they came up with in that particular field study? Leslie. Yeah, so Leslie's saying that one of the key findings in that study was that the people who didn't have windows put up a lot more stuff, and the stuff they put up was much more nature-dominated, much more landscape-oriented rather than urbanscape. So rather than putting up a poster of New York City skyscrapers, they'd put up a natural park, or they'd put up flowers or something like that. So they found these trends pretty strongly. And here are some of the data from that particular study. And when they talk about the number of offices above the median and below the median, that means in the windowless offices, there were many more people above the median that were putting in more decorations. So people in windowless offices tended to decorate their offices, whereas in the windowed office space, there were actually more people below the median, not as much decoration going on. So that was one of the key findings, just the amount of stuff people put up, items per wall. In this particular slide, where you're comparing people putting up landscapes or cityscapes, you can see the predominance in the windowless offices of landscapes compared to cityscapes, whereas in the windowed offices, you do have more landscapes. People generally like natural views and nature photos, but much more pronounced in the windowless offices up here. And then in the next slide, this is looking at nature-dominated decorations and non-nature decorations. And here you see in the windowless offices much more emphasis on nature-oriented photos, posters, things like that, compared to non-nature. Here you've got a little bit of a trend toward nature-dominant, but not as pronounced as in the windowless offices. So you can see that in the windowless situation, people are putting up more items, to try to make their space more interesting, and they're putting up more nature-dominated items. They have this kind of yearning for the natural environment that they're not seeing through their windows, so they try to provide it through their own decorations. One of the things that people are doing in the design of buildings now is they're trying to bring natural light to the people in the lower floors or in the windowless spaces through sun pipes. So you can use systems of mirrors to bring lighting down into the lower reaches of a building and create natural light, even though they're windowless spaces. So that's one adaptation that people are following for, if they're in a windowless space. Okay, so today we've talked about a variety of different kinds of guidelines. We started off picking up on the William White research, and we talked about public space guidelines and how you can dress up places like Main Street, Santa Ana, and bring in those elements that White talks about. We also talked about offices and windows. We talked a little bit about residential, but we're going to turn now to hospitals and healthcare environments. And we're also going to talk about Richard Florida's theory of the creative class and what that implies for designing environments that attract people that want certain kinds of settings to do their work. Now, this book here by Jan Reisenstein-Karpman and Stan Grant, really, it was published by the American Hospital Association, and it's a nice compendium of design guidelines for healthcare facilities. So they bring in environmental cognition and cognitive mapping, wayfinding. How do you get around a healthcare facility campus? How do you bring nature into treatment rooms and patients' rooms and give them views of nature? How do you enable visitors and patients to regulate privacy, especially when you've got two patients assigned to the same room? So all of these concepts from environmental psychology we've been talking about, she and her colleagues pull them together in this book. Comfortable levels of lighting, temperature, and sound, wayfinding, nature, regulation of privacy, symbols, environmental symbolism to convey that the people that run that place care about the patients and aren't treating them as simply captives. Now, in the next slide here, you can see some of the guidelines that come into play, like signage. You want to make your signage legible or imageable. People, have a clear image of where they're going in that place. Or you want these window views that Ulrich talked about. So I'm going to show you a few of those principles. Beth, I'm going to switch to the 35. So this is an earlier version of that book, Design That Cares. You can order it from the American Hospital Association, but there's a section of it assigned today. And this is what hospitals used to look like. They used to be this sort of institutional kind of approach. People were captives once they went into the hospital. Families were not allowed to visit except very circumscribed hours. It was a kind of a pretty steely, hard surface, hard environment, as Robert Summer would say, tight architecture. And hospitals, before we had so much emphasis on wellness and on using facility design to enhance the therapy, enhance people getting better, they were very much focused on treatment of illness. So when people got sick, they went into the hospital, they had surgery, and we weren't so much focused on trying to get them to improve their health and their wellness before they got sick. And now those of you who are public health majors know that the disease prevention and health promotion movement is very, very strong, and we're a lot more sophisticated about that now, so that physical environments are now part of disease prevention and health promotion. So when we talk about wayfinding, how do we make the signage and the graphics of a hospital campus or the interior more legible for patients and visitors? This is an example of a hospital campus where I did an environmental assessment. And one of the things you can see here, it's maybe a little hard to see the colors, but you've got arrows associated going in the same direction with different colors. So the emergency room direction is going straight ahead, but also the doctor's offices are straight ahead. Then you've got some of these other, the McDonald Center and the Whittier Institute. You've got some of these other things also in the gray zone. So you're mixing directions and colors rather than segmenting them to make them easier to chunk. So if you're driving onto that campus and you want to tell quickly, how do I get here or there, a better approach is really to keep the directions and colors together. And also you want to avoid anything that's blocking people's view, like a tree that might get in the way. So here on campus, this is not a healthcare environment, but one of the things that the designers did here is they tried to make all the directions going to the left in this maroon color, everything to the right in blue, and then all other in green. So that way people are able to pick up more legibly, especially when they're driving in a car, where they want to go, because the colors and the directions are all chunked together. So it makes it less overloading. It makes it more legible. Now, this is an example of a signage board as you walk into the entrance of a particular hospital where it's really hard to figure out what's going on, to pick up and find what you need there, because there's so many different labels, so many different departments in that directory. And to the hospital's credit, they did an environmental audit, and then they changed their signage. They made it more legible. But some of the other areas that were similarly difficult to read, if you're somebody walking through at a fast clip, and remember we said we want to make the environment scaled to pedestrians so they can figure out what's going on as they move through it. Well, here you've got the signage up above, and you've got these different directions, same colors. So you've got to be able to pick that up and, pull it out of the weeds there because there's so much information. Same kind of thing here. Now, another way to do it, and this is a different facility, is to make the signage much simpler and bigger. So as somebody walks through this front entrance, they can see where the patient check-in is, they can see where the registration desk is, and then they're able to have a sense of knowing where they are, not being as lost. So you want to avoid that sense of being lost, that sense of being overwhelmed. And that's what Dr. Misra talked about when she was talking about environmental cognition and wayfinding and legibility, right? So we're applying that principle. We're taking that behavioral principle of environmental cognition and legibility. Now we're applying it to a design guideline for a hospital campus. Another thing we know is that when you put numbers on buildings, the numerical address of a building, people don't remember that. It just goes, in one side and out the other. You don't really retain that kind of information. Whereas when you put verbal labels on buildings, and here you've got that kind of labeling here, people are much able to sort of find their way and remember what they need to know. So you want to avoid that kind of numerical addressing and go for more of the labeling, because it gives people more mnemonic memory devices to be able to code that and remember it. Now, you can't see the details in this particular slide too well, but this is a water element here with a fountain. These are indirect skylighting. You've got some trees and art on the walls here. And this is Scripps Clinic, where you walk in and you have almost a hotel environment. It's not so much a captive institutional environment, but the patient feels they're being welcomed in as a customer who's highly valued. They want you to be there. They want your business. They want you enjoy your stay as much as you can, even if you're in for surgery or something like that. So they try to make that environment more amenable, and that's using the facility in a very strategic way. You're using it to create a kind of comfort for patients so they don't feel alienated from that space. And then, as we saw in Ulrich, you're strategically using window views of nature to help the therapeutic regimen along. So people are less stressed, they need less pain medication. So it's using the physical facility in a strategic way to achieve the health outcomes there. In this oncology outpatient treatment area, you've got this indirect parabolic lighting to reduce glare. You've got a pastel color scheme, which is more gentle and soothing than sort of bright primary colors. You've got plants, natural elements there. You've got art on the walls. Anything you can do to humanize that environment, because people who are in there are under a lot of stress. They're being treated for very serious illness. So here you see the aquarium, which not only is visually interesting with the water, but it also makes kind of water sounds. So it's calming. It provides some ambient sound in that space. In the examination areas, they also kind of carry that theme of the pastel colors and the artwork on the walls, which is very important to kind of make it a more humane space. So these are aspects of our ambient environment that we used to take for granted, we didn't think much about. And then when you had books like Pattern Language by Chris Alexander, or you had the field of environmental psychology growing up, people started to think about these things and saying, hey, you know, the ambient environment does affect us, even though we've been ignoring it and assuming that it doesn't. We talked about the value of open space, and the patients in these rooms can look out and see that open space. Now, as I mentioned, they did put a parking structure there in later years to accommodate more cars. So that, you know, you lose that amenity, and you know, from a facility planner or hospital administrator's point of view, maybe that space is wasted because it's just all open. You're not stacking cars there, you're not using it for some kind of facility. So you put something that is able to use the footprint of that land in a more productive way, so to speak. But we know that there are also these indirect benefits of having that open space and the natural views. We saw that from Ulrich's study. You can also bring nature and sunlight into the interior of patient floors. So here, even if a patient isn't ambulatory, can't get out of the hospital, they can maybe see that space from their room or maybe go into it and, you know, sit out there with some natural light and sunlight. So you can bring that to the patients. And this is one of Chris Alexander's patterns called indoor sunlight, where he's saying that you need to bring natural light into the interior of buildings. He was a big believer in natural light in buildings and windows. And for good reason. He did a lot of studies that suggested, in talking with people, occupants of buildings, a lot of different kinds of spaces, that they appreciated the natural light and they appreciated those resources, the windows, the views that they afford. Now, this is a classroom that no longer exists at UCI. Like Pruitt-Igoe, it was demolished. And everyone thought this was kind of a cool place because it was designed by Gehry, the very famous architect from Los Angeles. But this was one of the Gehry buildings on campus that never worked so well. It was an engineering classroom facility. It was dominated by fluorescent downlights, very rigid plastic seating here. So the campus got rid of it, and the campus got more and more sophisticated about how to design classrooms. So today we have classrooms with smart technology. We have different lighting treatments. We have, you know, padded chairs that you're in. So it's not quite as hard architecture as these classrooms used to be. This is a computer science, the old computer science building. Again, there are some windows here, but all the shades are closed to prevent glare, and you've got this domination by the fluorescent downlights, which tends to be pretty harsh. It's not the most, it's not the softest kind of comfortable lighting for people. A lot of times those buzz, so it's got a kind of a hard feel to it. This is an old basement office in the UCI library, the Langston Library. And the folks that lived and but the folks that worked down in the basement there had no recourse but to at least get their bosses to put up a big natural landscape poster here. So at least they had that surrogate view of nature, even though they didn't really have nature down in the basement. But that's what the study you read today about windowless offices at the University of Washington is talking about. It's when people don't have those windows, they don't have the natural light, they try to cope and compensate by putting up decorations or creating their own artificial windows. Here at the University Extension office building, one of the things that they've tried to do there is to give people a mixture of lighting options. We said that mixed uses are good for public spaces, but mixed lighting options are also good because they give users the control to use a task light on their desk. They have some diffuse uplighting here that creates a kind of softer feel. They have some skylighting here for sideways indirect lighting. They have these lights along the back here that provide some illumination on the wall. And then they have these windows out to the outside that brings in natural light. So those folks have a very rich array of lighting choices. And to the extent you can give people control over their lighting, rheostats and other kinds of controls that allow them to change the illumination level or turn off, substitute fluorescent and get rid of that and put in an incandescent. A lot of people bring in their own incandescent lights to their windowless offices to get rid of the fluorescent kind of feel. And here are some class buildings in Extension where they're trying to do at least provide some windows along with these different kinds of incandescent lights along with the fluorescent. Here you've got a kind of ceiling light, sunlight here, along with the other lights. And this is one of the buildings in the Extension offices. So these are some things you can do with lighting to give people choice, more control. Now, one of the important points to know about design guidelines is often you have different stakeholders using the same environment. So many times the way classrooms were designed, they catered to administrative efficiency and custodians' preferences in terms of how to clean a classroom quickly after it's vacated. They weren't catering to maybe students' needs for movable chairs, which are harder to maintain. They weren't catering to occupants' preferences for art in the room, so you don't see a lot of art on the classroom wall. So you have these different stakeholder groups, administrators, custodians, students, all using the same classroom. So you have some of the complexities here that we're talking about is you've got these different types of design guidelines required for different kinds of settings. So workplaces, healthcare settings, they all have a different type of guideline that's going to be emphasized. Within any particular setting, you have to take into account the diverse perspectives of multiple user groups, and otherwise you can get into trouble. So the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles took into account and maximized the acoustical preferences of musicians. Those were great. But for pedestrians outside that facility or for the people living in apartment buildings near the concert hall that got all that reflected sunlight and it heated up their buildings, they weren't taken into account so much. So you've got multiple user groups, and you've got these conflicts that come up sometimes between the different user groups. So it's not always so easy to just sit down and scratch out some design guidelines that work for everybody. They have to be prioritized often, and some people that are leading a particular setting or organization that are administering it make these decisions. Whose design guidelines or preferences are we going to maximize? And you have to update them periodically because over time, technology changes, people's preferences and fashions change. So design guidelines for one era of classrooms are not going to be the same as for another era. And the same thing goes for homes and residences. We never used to have to think about fiber optic, and now every home just about that you want to consider or apartment building has to be wired with Wi-Fi and have that internet capability. 20 years ago we weren't thinking that way. So you have to keep these design guidelines current and updated. And this makes the point that in hospitals you've got the nurses, you've got the patients, you've got the visitors, you've got the physicians, and they all have a different take on what's to be maximized. Nurses don't like a lot of interference from family members telling them, what kind of medication to provide or not provide. And a lot of times family members in hospitals become patient advocates. They look out for their relatives because sometimes the nurses may not be looking out for them the way they think they should. So you've got these different groups or stakeholders, and often the design guidelines have to kind of take their different perspectives into account. we mentioned classrooms, and this is a very interesting study by Robert Summer, the guy that wrote Tight Spaces and came to Irvine and compared our engineering building to San Quentin. And at UC Davis, he was sort of a vigilante professor, just like the gardener. Bob Summer thought he's going to mess around a little bit with the classrooms and kind of make them more amenable to students, even if the administrators and the custodians might not like that so much. He wanted to try this out and study it. So he did get permission to do some research on these alternative classrooms. And he says in his article on the soft classroom, this is not a sign, but I want to bring it in because it's interesting. He said, for design researchers on a college campus, the classroom represents the most accessible design problem. Students who have difficulty visualizing a public housing project in St. Louis or the tract houses of Levittown, which we're going to talk about on Thursday, can respond immediately to a discussion of sterile, ugly, and dysfunctional desks and chairs in their classrooms. He says it's easier to plan a city on the moon than to change a single classroom. Most researchers are not trained or selected for such wearisome bureaucratic struggles. The result is that the design, layout, and maintenance of university buildings belongs to administrators and custodians, and designers and environmental psychologists have little input. So he wanted to create an alternative classroom. Now, he was writing in 1980. I think his work helped create a change in people's mentality about instructional environments. And on this campus, we created task forces to study our classrooms and come up with design guidelines for better learning environments. So Summer's work was sort of cutting edge. There wasn't a lot of attention to this when he was doing this alternative classroom work. And, you know, as a benefit of his having done that, I think, you know, a lot of instructional spaces have improved on university environments. But what he did, he brought in pillows, foam cushions instead of chairs. He brought in writing boards instead of desks, carpeting, lighting controls, graffiti pads. And you can see a picture there of his alternative classroom. He had some interesting carpeting, very comfortable sort of couch-like seating. And what he found when he studied students' participation rates in the traditional versus the alternative decorated or treated classroom like this, participation rates were 2 to 3 times as high in the alternative classroom than in the traditional classroom with rows of desks. So he was claiming that you could create a more sociopolitical, active, participatory classroom by loosening up the physical environment, making it more comfortable, making it more informal. And so he came up with some design guidelines for classrooms based on that research. So that's another kind of facility where you can take performance principles, environmental psychology concepts, and apply them, whether it's sociopolitical, space, how do you make a space more participatory, more social, and bring that to a learning environment, just like we can bring it to a public space, a street setting, a residence, a workplace, a healthcare facility. This gets back to what I was mentioning before in terms of the different stakeholder groups that are interested in the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. You know, you've got the residents who view that beautiful structure as a kind of iconic image, an emblem of Los Angeles. Makes Los Angeles more imageable because we now have that Geary building to look at and have as part of our city. You've got pedestrians in downtown LA, and this is something that William White talks about when he was talking about the Bonaventure Hotel, which he claims turns its back brutally to the city and sort of defensively protects what's inside the hotel, but doesn't care much about what's outside of it. So if you're a pedestrian walking here, you've got this monolithic, non-human scale kind of concrete facade. The designers figured, that wasn't as big a priority as making the acoustics good, making the outside design beautiful. But nonetheless, it is something that sometimes is criticized about the way that facility is sited to the street and to the sidewalks. Then you've got the musicians, and most musicians love playing in the Geary Concert Hall because the acoustics are so good, and it's a beautiful space. How many of you have been inside that concert hall? Any of you? You guys really should check it out and go to a concert there. It's a great space to hear music. But you've got these folks living in these apartment buildings nearby that brought protest and were threatening lawsuits against the concert center in the city because this shiny roof was reflecting so much heat at their apartment building. So the architects had to come back and scrub those ceiling surfaces down so they were less reflective. and didn't put out as much lighting and heat to the adjacent buildings. So they were inconvenienced initially by the design that was actually too shiny. So you can see how all these different perspectives play into designing design guidelines. You don't have one monolithic set of guidelines, but you've got to take into account the perspectives of a lot of different people. I assigned a section of Richard Florida's book, The Creative Class. And he argues that he's a regional economist. He's not an environmental psychologist, but he discovered Jane Jacobs and he's discovered Oldenburg's theory of third places. And he said that 30% of the U.S. population makes their living by creating ideas, music, art, intellectual capital. And those people like cities that have certain features. They don't have to live in a big industrial place like Detroit anymore. They can move to Austin, Texas. They can move to Berkeley. They can move to a small rural town on a mountain and do their work virtually with their computer. So what are they looking for? And what they're looking for helps drive economic growth in any region, because if you have a lot of creative people coming into a region, that's like an economic engine that drives that region and creates a lot of jobs. So we've got some places in the U.S. that are losing population that used to be industrial centers, but people don't necessarily want to live in those kind of environments. They want environments that have nightlife. They want environments that have culture, that have natural environments. So his theory is all focused on the choices of creative people. And he talks about the 3 T's of regional economic development. They have to have talent, technology, and tolerance. They have to be places that tolerate different lifestyles, different points of view, different ethnicities. So there's not a lot of prejudice and hateful stuff against one group or another. People get along. And when you have that kind of environment, you have a much more economically viable community. So, he talks about the quality of place being so important. Characteristics that define a place, make it attractive. What's there? Do you have interesting natural and built environments for people that want to be creative in what they're pursuing? Who's there? What are the kinds of people that are trying to interact with each other? What's going on? Do you have street life? Do you have third places, cafes, those kinds of things? So he's saying in his research that you can actually rate cities in terms of their appeal to creatives. And you can go on his website, creativeclass.org, and find out where your community rates in terms of its tolerance level, in terms of its interestingness of the environment. And he also has calculated something he calls a gay index, which is the residents' tolerance for alternative sexual lifestyles. Now, why would he pick that? Well, that's a pretty good barometer of how tolerant and open-minded a particular population might be. If they're open to different lifestyles and they're not coming down on people that don't fit a particular lifestyle, he's claiming that's part of an economic vibrancy.